I've described how I wrote my most recent book, Perspective and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord, because of great concern I feel about how, with issues of every sort, people today are dividing almost immediately into polar camps. After addressing causes with each chapter in the book, I describe how we might bring culturally mature perspective to one issue where divisiveness too often prevails. I chose the concerns I did because each has something particular to teach us about addressing issues more systemically. The topic of climate change, besides illustrating cultural maturity-related themes I've touched on, like responsibility, accepting of limits, and the importance of foresight, helps highlight the importance of the distinction between culturally mature decision-making and compromise, simply splitting the difference. I've noticed how a basic observation provides the architecture for the book. In times past, when we encountered polarized positions and partisan advocacy, our task was obvious and unquestioned. We assumed that there was only two options and that our job was to figure out which one was right and fight for it. As we look to the future, polarization has very different implications. We recognize that what we are seeing is left and right hands of a larger systemic picture, and the fact of polarization alerts us to the fact that neither side has yet to ask the hard question that ultimately needs to be addressed. I first wrote about the possible dangers of climate change over 30 years ago. At the times, I could not have imagined that we would be so slow in taking these dangers seriously, and certainly I did not have any sense that climate change would become so contentious and polarizing. Today, it is one of the issues where we can assume people have taken unquestioning positions before conversations even begin. What we find with climate change provides a great example of how making progress on essential issues necessarily starts with asking the right question. The question with climate change as conventionally asked focuses on whether the science is definitive, whether science has proven that climate change is real and man-made. But that was not the question I was asking decades back when I concluded that climate change needed to be taken seriously. I knew that solid data would take time, and even if we had more data, proof in this sense is not what science is about. The real question with climate change is not whether the science is right or wrong, but rather whether the risks as best we can know them are worth the gamble. On the basis of risk assessment, it was clear to me even at that time that the climate change question had in effect already been answered. I will sometimes ask people who make the accurate limits-related observation that we can't know with absolute certainty whether global climate change is real, and then use it to justify not responding to the threat, how they would feel about their children playing Russian roulette. I then ask them what they think the odds are that human-caused warming of the planet is happening and could have dangerous consequences. I make them commit to a number. Few people are willing to claim that the odds of global climate or of global warming being real and significant are less than Russian roulette's 1 in 6. And the few who might maintain this claim have a hard time escaping the recognition that their conclusions have more to do with ideology than carefully considered evaluation. It would be easy to think from this description that I side wholly with the position of the political left when it comes to climate change. But in the end, this is not the case. Recognizing just how this is so helps clarify how the task with cultural mature understandings is much more nuanced and interesting than just finding some middle ground. To appreciate how the contribution to the right also pertains to the climate change debate, it helps to think of the climate question as having two parts. There's a question of whether human-caused climate change is real. There's also the question of just what to do if it is. The need to think more systemically applies in each case, but in ways that have different consequences. With the question of whether climate change is real, the important distinction is that ideology is not how I arrived at my conclusion. I consider people on the political left who assume climate change is real while knowing very little about it to miss the point just as fundamentally as climate change deniers. Their ideological blinders are much less likely to cause immediate harm than the absolutist claims of the political right, but the basis for the conclusions is no closer to being systemic in a culturally mature sense. As far as what to do about it, including all the crayons in the systemic box becomes more clearly essential. There are multiple strategies we can apply for addressing climate change. Some are more societal, others more technical. With each kind of strategy, the right and the left each have insights to contribute. They are also each often in denial about significant blindnesses. With more societal interventions, we commonly encounter traps on both the right and the left. If the right is willing to entertain the basic conclusion that human-caused climate change is real, it is still likely to think that we can get away with making changes slowly. In fact, the data that we have makes clear that we really don't have the luxury of taking our time. But the left is vulnerable to an opposite kind of trap. If we make changes without carefully thinking them through, we could see the collapse of economies, and most likely it would be the economic conditions of people who are already the most vulnerable that would be affected first. Those of more ideological inclination on the left are quick to assert that the development of more sustainable energy resources will boost economies, and I agree, at least in the long term. But I also think that the common assumption of the left that a transition to renewable energy will happen rapidly and smoothly without collateral damage is naive and more a reflection of polarized thinking than a kind of reasoned reflection. Ideological blindnesses also present obstacles when it comes to more technical solutions. And again, they intrude from both the right and the left. From the right, as the consequences of rising temperatures mount, we could see a strong push to apply simple technical fixes. An array of approaches that could artificially lower planetary temperatures are potentially available, from the seeding of clouds to reflect the sun's rays, to altering ocean acidity, to less radical methods that capture and store carbon. But most good scientists counsel caution with approaches, at least the more extreme of such approaches. At this point, we have no way of knowing whether the results ultimately would do more harm than benefit, and certain unintended consequences could well be catastrophic. It is possible that over time we may decide that some such methods are safe enough given the alternatives, at least as temporary measures. My point is simply that if we do eventually decide to make use of more technical interventions, we must do so with reasoned consideration, not out of reactions of a simple answer ideological sort. From the left, blindnesses of a more technical sort manifest in the requirement that interventions must pass tests of ideological purity. The left tends to assume that certain approaches, such as solar, wind, and geothermal, are unquestionably good, even a bit holy. These methods are appropriately celebrated as central parts of any solution. But again, if we are to recognize where there may be needed trade-offs and apply approaches wisely, the basis for choosing a method can't simply be ideology. We also have to think to be sure that other approaches that might have potential benefit are not dismissed out of hand. In my book, Hope in the Future, I described how I have gone back and forth through the years as far as nuclear power's appropriate role. At one point in my life, I spoke out strongly against nuclear power. More recently, I've become more open to at least thinking of it as part of the solution, at least for the short term. I've been surprised to find people on the left not only taking immediate issue with the suggestion, but in several instances rejecting the whole book because I had entertained it. Effective decision-making in response to climate change will require a sophistication of perspective that few people at this point bring to the conversation. It will demand a complex array of difficult choices and an acceptance of the fact that the unexpected can intrude at any step along the way. The one thing we can know for sure is that positions based on easy answer political ideologies can only get in the way. Key to the necessary maturity of engagement will be having everyone affected in the room. Equally key will be everyone involved being open to having their assumptions challenged. To get at just what the needed, more encompassing perspective will require of us, we can think in terms of no's and yeses for each side. The no to the right is that denial in the face of science is no longer an option. The yes is that values of all sorts need to be considered in setting priorities. The no to the left is that economic as well as environmental considerations ultimately need to be taken into account. The yes to the left is the importance of making the confronting of climate change a very real high priority in the decades ahead. We can also find guidance in what is being asked of us and the needed new kinds of skills and capacities I've noticed in previous episodes. In particular, climate change highlights the importance of taking a more ultimate kind of responsibility. Confronting climate change effectively will require a newly encompassing responsibility for our larger human well-being. It will also require a degree of foresight that has rarely been needed or possible. The importance of acknowledging complexity and uncertainty essentially defines good risk assessment. And risk assessment directly confronts us with the fact of real limits, certainly what is possible, limits to what it is possible to know for sure. Here I've put particular emphasis on how successful risk assessment requires the acknowledgement of limits inherent to single crayon-in-the-box ideological assumptions of all sorts. The task again is not just to think new things, but to think in new ways. Efforts that attempt to balance the concerns on the right and the left can be a start when it comes to risk assessment, but by themselves they are vulnerable to ending up only in endless debate and watered-down versions of time-worn solutions. Effective risk assessments requires at least the beginnings of integrated meta-perspective. We must step beyond once and for all truths of all kinds and think in ways that are more encompassing and complete. We again encounter our now familiar apparent paradox. The task requires us to think in ways that are more nuanced and complex. But with reflection, the need to do so becomes rather obvious. And by helping us get beyond division, in the end, it makes things simpler. In the end, once more, it is just common sense. Again, I invite your thoughts and questions.